right, I'm gonna get started here. Hello, hi there. My name is Josh, and we just had the press play presentation for Rockhopper, yeah, it was really fantastic. About 25 people came, and I got some really cool questions about the project. And big thanks to Matt from NYU for actually facilitating the whole process. I'm here at NYU still, just after the presentation is finished. Mainly because I'm recording this mainly because there was a technical difficulty and we were unable to record the actual presentation. So I'm just gonna run through quickly here because a lot of people were unable to make it, and that's totally cool. And I wanted to record it so that I could share this with you guys as well, and field any questions that you have. So I'm going to run through it. We're going to keep this pretty brief. I'm going to do my best. And yeah, let's just jump right in. So welcome to the presentation. It's called 12 Months of Work Condensed into a Presentation Just for You. And it's my process of building, documenting, and refining Rockhopper. So we're going to start with part one. So look at that prototype. This is like the very beginning. So if we take a look here, this was the first thing I ever made. It was just a guy who could run around in a scene. I thought it was very fun. It felt really cool. You couldn't really shoot anything, but you could sure as hell pretend that you were really badass with two guns running around. And I didn't really know what I was going to do with this yet. I was really just experimenting and sort of finding out what felt nice. And if we go to the next slide here. Yeah, so then, I added a few more aspects. I added the treads, so now he's sort of driving on the ground, and now he has guns, and there's a meter on his back, and lasers, and bullets that you're firing, and now you're shooting stuff, and it feels cool, and this perspective is cool, and I was just sort of messing around and running with it, with sort of under the guise of, I enjoy the way this feels, and I enjoy the way this looks. So there was no real plan, nothing really specific yet. I'm going to go to the next slide here. Yeah, and so then I just kind of started experimenting, like, what's in this world, right? Like, what's the context? What are you doing? And the first thing that came into my mind was mining and collecting resources and fighting bad guys, right? So now you can pretend to shoot this guy, and he can shoot back at you. And you can also break rocks and collect the stuff inside of them. And, this was a neat little game, and it was fun to mess around and fun to play. So I just sort of ran with it. I was passionate about the way that this felt. I liked the way that it was, and we're gonna watch this as it grows. So, running with this concept, I had a few more things that I enjoyed doing. So, first thing that I did was kind of outline all of the elements that were important and make them glow. Because if anyone knows me, this is like the first thing I do with every game that I make, is I make it look really dark and glowy because I think it looks really fun. Just sort of messing around with it. There's more effects. There's particles. There's lighting. The player has health. Bullets are more outlined, stuff like that. That just made it feel a little bit more refined, a little more interesting. You still only are pretending to fight them because, not actually fighting them. You can't actually lose or win, for that matter. And, I added some more elements to it. I finally made it so that you can kill the enemies, so you're not just bumbling around and pretending. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, there you go. So more resources. So now you have 3 different kinds of things you can collect. Your shots matter. Your actions matter. You can die. There's meaning to this game. You're a little robot running around, finding stuff. And what are you doing? That's still very unclear. But there's a loop now. There's pillars everywhere, and they spawn enemies, and you're kind of seeing how long you can survive. Stuff like that. That's just neat. It's just fun to mess around with. So. It was around this point where the semester began, so last semester began, and I brought this project to the class project studio, where students are able to work on projects for class credit. So I asked myself, this is cool, but have you considered doing more? I had. So I started thinking, how can I make these levels more interesting? Can I make a generation system? And I did. I made a generation system, and this was the second iteration of the generation for this game. And the levels themselves were pretty boxy. They were interesting. You could go from asteroid to asteroid, and I thought it was super neat. And this was sort of the beginning of this first iteration of the whole game, where you were exploring asteroids, going from asteroid to asteroid, finding resources, and fighting enemies. Hence the name Rockhopper. And here's just a how it looks when you're playing in them. So you can go in these levels, they were functional, and there were enemies that you were fighting, resources you were collecting, things you were discovering. It felt cool. It was a huge milestone for me to be able to go from level to level, and just making that work was just a really fun process. Okay, so at this point I have a thing, it's functional, it's interesting, I like it. What does it look like? And I began to experiment, and I did a lot of work on this. And I added a whole hub area. I added a player character that was more interesting. I added UI that was more interesting. I added NPCs that were more interesting. The dropship, the environment, everything about it, I just went over into a whole pass on it. And I chose to go with this sort of volumetrics type of lighting that gave this very refined and polished feel to the environment. I gave everything character. The ground is no longer just this flat plane, even though it mostly is in this case. The walls themselves are bumpier and more interesting. The enemies are more interesting, and they are more difficult, right? They fire more. There's more things you have to think about. But ultimately, I will be honest, in the back of my mind, I was thinking this doesn't feel like the game that I want to make. This doesn't feel like the experience that I want to give. So once I started thinking that, I was like, what do I want to do? What is the experience I want to give? And I started to think maybe this just feels weird because things are off. Maybe something's wrong. And I began to redo the map designs. I redid the enemy designs. I redid a lot of the visuals. What you're looking at now is sort of a further iteration of that original visual design. And there was a lot to it. Maybe the resources feel weird. Maybe the environment feels weird. Maybe the UI feels weird. And I changed all these aspects, but ultimately I felt like something was wrong. And this is just another example of this looks really cool, and I really like the way that this environment feels and operates, but ultimately I felt like something was missing. It was lacking a character, or it was lacking some kind of aspect I'm having trouble pinpointing that just didn't give it the vibe or the experience that I wanted it to have. And I began experimenting a lot, right? Here's some more visual shader tests, right? Where you have sort of this unlit shading that is much more cartoony and much more unique and individual to a game like this. It's not like the very well-known graphics shading of a low poly environment that is pretty common, right? This lighting is very common. And I was pretty happy with this, and I experimented with it some more, but I ultimately decided it was a little too unclear because if you're playing a game with combat, you need to have hard edges and things need to be definable. So I started messing around with world space shaders and painting some assets too. And while this looked really cool and it worked, it took way too long. And both in terms of just programming the shaders and getting everything to work and look nice. And then on the right, just UVing every single asset was going to take way too long since I'm a solo dev. So I started experimenting with different kinds of visual styles that began to give it more character. And even though I had these two main ones, one of which was the very polished one that we had mentioned earlier, and the other that was very oblique. I think it's very blocky, it's very in your face, it's very defined in a lot of cases. These two were nice, and I think that they gave a lot of character to each aspect, so I ultimately combined them, and I kind of made this duo, this dynamic version of both of them, where you're getting that definitive marking of the edges and the shadows and outlines of characters and objects, but you're also getting that depth and that fog and that polish. And then, of course, there was the whole aspect of it's too easy. This game feels too easy. It doesn't feel fun. It doesn't feel like the experience that I want. And I kept on coming back to this question. I kept on saying, this doesn't feel like the game that I want it to be, and I need to identify what that is. So I added a really difficult boss battle at the end, and I found a couple things from this. The first thing is that this was really difficult, and it was really cool. It added this very strong aspect to the game that I felt like was super needed. It was a goal. It was the end goal that was hard, and you were working towards it the whole time. And even just that one small aspect of this is your end goal, and this is what you want to do, and this is your goal for being here, this is why you're playing the game, that added a lot, and it helped you guide the perspective and guide the intention of what the player was actually thinking about and doing moment to moment, and thus room to room in the game. If I just go to the next slide here. So yeah, more combat tests as well. So here's another enemy that I had worked with a lot and kind of messed with. It's more interesting to have to think, I need to kill the shield creation thing and then the shields around every character. And people started really liking it. It was only once I had all these combat elements in that things began to get more interesting for both myself and players. Because up until this point, I'm going to be honest, I continuously ask myself, what do I actually want to do with this game, right? And this is Cole, and Cole is the only person to actually have beaten every single iteration of Rockhopper that I've ever put out. He was the first person to have beaten Rockhopper, and Cole is pretty badass. I really appreciate it. This picture was taken at 8:30 in the morning, where Cole had beaten the game at the end of Project Studio, and so shout out to Cole. It started getting a little bit of community. People started enjoying it. And then the semester ended, and I asked myself if I could do it all over again, would I? And the answer is yes, I ultimately would. So I started doing that. I started redoing the character. I started thinking, I want the player to be a part of this world, and to do that, the character has to be at least a little bit relatable. So I began experimenting with humanoid character motion and humanoid animation, and just kind of reiterating that I'm a solo developer, so I can't really do all of the animation all of the time, right? I have to come up with systems as I'm developing that warrant solo developer levels of work and hours. So in this case, this character is animated almost entirely out of programming, so they're not actually animated using any animations that I created. There's sample animations which then get interpreted by a set of variables and algorithms that I wrote. And the feet will stand on the environment and the arms will look where you're looking. And this allowed me to actually start experimenting more with stuff that's known as inverse kinematics, where now I can actually just tell the game what I want the arms to do instead of animating those arms one at a time, right? And animation is extremely strenuous, so being able to just grab and manipulate the arms helps a lot, because now I can have the player hold things, I can have them wave, I can have them run around, I can do all these things that would otherwise be exceedingly costly to program and animate and refine, and now it's just here. And this took a little while to set up for sure, but it was worth it in the long run, because now I don't have to think about that since I'm the only person working on this. And that's a theme we're going to come back to. So here's so now I have this new player. It looks really cool. I really like it. And it still felt off. Everything about this kind of still felt off. It wasn't the experience that I wanted. I wasn't sure what was wrong. I wasn't sure why it felt wrong. I just knew that I had to keep experimenting. And I kept on saying, if I could start over, would I? And I said yes. So I started over on the player. Then I thought, okay, well, I've got to start over on everything. I have to wipe everything clean and begin again. So we're about 8 months into the process. Here we are at the first level test that I did with rewritten enemy AI. I remade the enemies entirely, and then I also remade the map. So everything in here is just sort of raw. It's a completely different game than it was before, if you are looking at it now, right? The game of the little guy running around, collecting rocks and fighting enemies in environments in third person is ultimately very different from this combat-driven, dashing, fast, speed-oriented combat, right? Which feels really good. And this was the first gameplay demo that I actually made where I couldn't stop playing it. I really liked it. I was playing this combat demo over and over and over, seeing what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it. That was the point at which I was like, okay, I'm feeling this specific thing that I haven't felt with this game before, which is that I want to keep playing it on my own and doing it again and again and again. And it felt really good to want to do that. And I really enjoyed it. And sort of running with that theme, I decided to just sort of explore what map design meant to this game and what the world looked like in this game. And the previous narrative for the game wasn't really refined, it wasn't fleshed out, and it didn't have any say in what the environment was. So now that I have this new direction, I thought, okay, what had happened in this world? What is going on? And ultimately, I settled on the idea of alien ruins, and this idea that you're running around a planet where a giant war between giant robots happened, and the debris and leftover enemies and robots that are there are what you're fighting through. And there's more to it than that for sure, but it does give this incredibly cool environmental design facet where you have these giant arms everywhere that look very similar to you. and we'll return to that later. But yeah, so the environment that you're looking at now was the first combat test environment that I actually started giving to people. And this one, I remember I made it, and then I played it for a few hours. I played it for like 2 hours, and I had sent it to someone, and they played it for about half an hour and did it until they could get a no-hit run. And they said it felt really good. And that was really encouraging, because not only was it now like, I enjoyed this game, I like this game, it was other people saying, I enjoy this game and I want you to make more of it. And yeah, we'll continue with that as well. And yeah, just thinking about that idea of this world that has sort of fallen into ruin but is already sort of ancient, right? So giant arms that are grabbing things, and pillars of the environment, giant missiles that had crashed in, things that are falling over one another. And then, thinking about multi-level level design and verticality in that. What goes into something like that? How does it feel? What is recognizable as an objective? And, of course, I added jump pads as well and collectibles. So now you not only are moving through the environment to get around enemies and pathfind through bullets, but you're also trying to say, like, oh, do I need more power? Do I need more health? Do I want to hit a jump pad? Do I need to get out of here? And things like that. So as time went on, I refined the combat more and more, and I added more lighting, I added more enemies, I added more environmentals, and I added more particles. I rewrote the camera, added a wave system, and just sort of lots and lots of refinement went into it. And this experience is ultimately very similar to the most recent public build, with a few variances, of course. But yeah, so it was a lot of work. And getting to this point was really cool. And yeah, so that's sort of the process of getting up to this point. So it's been a long run up here. And now that we're here, I have to make this look good. I have to make it feel good to be in this environment. I have to portray that narrative, right? That visual storytelling that comes with a world that was once a flourishing environment and has now fallen, right? Like, why are you here? What makes you interested in this world? But I also had to think about the fact that I'm a solo developer. I had to think about, what can I do to make this process easier for myself? So I ultimately started experimenting with shaders in world space. So I began making it so that the computer did more of the work than me, which is good, because that means that I can start conceptualizing and visualizing things fast. And these rocks, for example, this whole set of assets I made in about 5 to 10 minutes, which is crazy, because if you were to do this and make each one of these individually, they would each take 5 to 10 minutes, right? So using world space shaders, I was able to just sort of begin to take these gray box assets that I had previously built and look at them in a new light and see, how does color affect these? What aspects do I need to fix, right? What aspects of these are good or bad or need work? And it began to get this vibe that had its own shape and it had its own feel, and I really liked the way that it felt to look at. Just experimenting with things like, what does it look like when something is wet? What does water look like in this world, right? And then, of course, I did some more saturated tests. I did some stuff that was a lot different than what I had originally imagined. These are inverse gradients. So basically what that means is, if you look on the bottom right here, these top 4 are gradients that go from light to dark. So they're lit from the environment. So whatever is facing the light source will be light, and whatever is not is dark, like a shadow. These ones are the opposite, and then they're highly saturated. So what you're getting is sort of this inverse kind of visual. And ultimately, I haven't used any of these yet, but I might do in the future. So now here we are. We have this environment that's really coming together. There's these visuals that feel pretty good, and there's aspects to it that feel really nice. And there's color, and there's, you can tell by context how far away things are. The outlines are way more subtle. I don't have to think about, making sure that everything is visible, because the style itself starts to take care of that. Just more visual examples of that as well. And then just also thinking about the ambience of this environment. I don't want this to feel like a dead world. It's a world that did die, but now you sort of are finding it overgrown and uncared for in some ways, right? You're moving through it and discovering it again, and sort of what that feels like and looks like. So getting down that vibe, And in this case, with just one particle effect, I feel like there's life to this world, and there's a human aspect of the things that you're seeing. And then as time went on, I started to think more and more, how can I give this more life? And through multiple different iterations of coloring and texturing, well, actually, no texturing, sorry, shading is the right word for that. I was able to make some more foliage and greenery to give it that overgrown aspect. If I go to the next slide. Yeah, so as I'm making these, I began to pull out the assets that I wanted to use, and just kind of going back to that solo developer aspect, I can't make everything unique. I have to reuse as much as possible. So as I'm building, I'm taking everything out and saying, okay, this is a thing that I can use, this is a thing that I can use, and reusing that over and over. And then just to reiterate on the shader stuff, to give it this overgrown vibe, there's actually a moss shader that I'm using, which literally I drag and drop onto an object, and it creates this green mossy effect that's sort of plant-like and overgrown and natural that I can just put on anything. So, and it'll always, be a part of the environment, and you get this really awesome, tiny, like you can see it really on this pillar and this 5G tower and one or two more objects in the scene, but it gives it this character that you don't really think about, but adds a lot of detail to it. So to think about going from this all the way to this in the span of, 6 months for that specific scene, it feels really good. I will say, too, that one thing that I'd like to bring up is the fact that as a solo dev, it's hard to keep motivation. It's really difficult because you're working alone. And that can be really tough. But actually setting goals for yourself and budgeting your time and saying, okay, this is the prototype, this is the thing that I'm starting with. In my head, I can envision what I'd like this to look like and how I want it to feel to move through this world, and going all the way to this point where you have, lighting and effects and environments and visuals, and it feels really good to have achieved that goal. And one thing that we were talking about in person when I was giving the presentation was that even for solo developers or small teams, goal setting and achieving those goals feels really good. And that is one of the ways that I've kept a lot of my motivation as I've worked on this project. Here's another map as well. I'm still working on these right now, but this map is actually it's the first combat test that I did, that I had given to people that I was talking about earlier. And it's coming along really well. I'm doing combat tests now in here, and this is ultimately what it looks like for the jungle-ish area, which we looked at earlier too. So that's the process of making the art. So what's coming next? There's a lot that I've done here. This is my Miro board, and it's got all my screenshots, it's got my presentations, it's got my mood boards, it's got my creative challenges, it's got my notes, it's got my balancing, my math, my comments, it's got everything. And I've thought a lot about a lot of aspects of this game, and there's a lot that I'd like to do with it, and I'm honestly just planning and moving through it as I feel priorities are worth. Or I feel what takes priority. So these are a bunch of different schedules that I put together, a bunch of different timelines. And I have to say, it was hard. I had to think about what I wanted to budget my time for. Did I want to make a gray box prototype? Did I want to make a minimum viable product? Or did I want to make something that was semi-polished? I ultimately chose the minimum viable product, and then at the bottom you can see 2 different schedules, which were sort of the thing that I could choose. And then I chose one of them, refined it more, and moved through it, and I stuck to it, and I dropped things and cut things that I couldn't complete, and now here we are, and we're nearing the end of the semester, and I have to think about what I'm going to do next. And ultimately, the things in black here on the schedule are going to be cut because they were stretch goals, and they just can't happen, unfortunately. My goal for this project is to end it by the 10th of May, so that by the 20th I can present it at the showcase. So just really planning everything, and then at the end of the semester actually doing a retrospect and saying, did I actually succeed here? Did I create the play experience that I wanted? And ultimately that's a question that I'm going to be asking myself once I get there. So what's next? I'd love to make this my thesis. It needs a lot more refining in a lot of places. Maybe I'll look for some additional help. I'd love to share it more online with people, and I'd like to make tweaks everywhere. So I believe that's it. Thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it. Everyone who came out, it was like 20 to 25 people, I can't remember, on Discord and in person. I really appreciate it. And I'll be sharing this video with the people outside the Game Center as well. Feel free to share it with people who might find it interesting as well. And what I'm going to do really quick is pop this up. And what I'll do is, since we had a few questions from the group that came here, I wrote them down, or they were typed in the channel, and I'll just quickly run through them and my replies to them so that everyone watching this recording can also get caught up on it. So the first question was, now that the game has changed a lot, are you going to change the name from Rockhopper? And originally the name Rockhopper originated because you're going from rock to rock, collecting resources and doing stuff. And ultimately it doesn't, you aren't doing that anymore. So because you're not doing that anymore, probably I'll change the name. I don't think it's it's a necessity just yet, but I do need to find something really cool that's representative of the actions that you're taking. So this is a very good question. That question was from Niusha, but next question is from Sean. There was a point in the process where you asked yourself, if I could start this all over, would I do it, to forward the process? Why was that specifically the question? So I talked about it a little bit in the actual presentation, but in reality, I was asking myself that question a lot. I wasn't sure if I should do that, but I always kind of felt whenever I was working on something like, this doesn't feel like the experience that I want. This doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel specifically what I wanted. And for a while I thought it was the visual aspect, and a while I thought it was the actual game itself as a whole. And sometimes I thought it was the enemies, sometimes I thought it was the player, and eventually I realized it was everything, and I had to start over, and that was just it, and I had no way around it. So it was why was it that question specifically was just because that was the right answer at the time. Everything is disposable in my ideology, no matter how long you've worked on it, and starting over is something I think that we should all think about when making our games. Aton says, you spoke a bit about backstory of the world that helps shape different aspects. Could you tell a bit more about that? Yeah, so the original concept for the narrative was that you were sort of on this mining colony, and you were with a lot of people who were there as a last resort, right? They were people who had previous lives that led them to be on the outskirts of society. They weren't there for fun. They weren't there because they wanted to be. And what I wanted to explore with that was the found family aspect of also being dejected from society, and what that means what it means to contribute to a community. That story was very different. It had nothing to do with the world. It had nothing to do with the environment. It was really just about the hub, and I'm not really interested in telling that specific story. As I've moved away from it, I've started to think more about indirect storytelling, right, where the things that are happening in the environment are much more akin to they're things that you can see and care about, right? And I'll just quickly bring up an example for the recording that I used in the presentation as well. For example, you walk into a room at one point and you see this giant guy, right? And you're thinking, like, what happened here? And he's huge, and he's rusted, and he's overgrown, and thinking, like, what is going on here, right? This indirect storytelling where you're not giving every single answer, and you have to discover them on your own by moving through the world. I've been looking a lot at Hyper Light Drifter and how they do it in that world, and also I also gave the example of Minecraft, because in Minecraft you're dropped into a world and you're just sort of told to figure it out, and I think that's really cool, and I think that's for more of an emergent narrative where you're not necessarily, where nothing is determined, nothing is like preordained. There is no end goal. But in Minecraft there are dragons and villages and giant mountain ranges and a couple different dimensions, and it's like, okay, go explore all of them and mess around and find a giant castle in hell and kill a flame monster, right? Like that's awesome. That's really cool, but it's emergent. It's not pre-planned. So Alex asks, I remember when designing your roadmap and plans, how did you organize your priorities and get a good feel for what may work and what's feasible for a solo dev? I remember the part of the presentation where you mentioned developing an art style to be done solo, and ideas like that are a really great solution, for example. So for that question specifically, I think that in this recording, I actually talked about it more, but yeah, ultimately it was a process of analyzing what aspects were going to be really difficult to do on my own, and then researching different ways to optimize them and help to make them more feasible for myself. For example, the animation system that I had talked about, was one big aspect as well, right? Where, if I can make the character's arms and legs move without animating each aspect individually, that's really awesome. That's really cool. I really like that. And it helps to optimize that, because now I can have them hold different objects, and I can have the character throw stuff if I wanted to, or I could have them do this, right? And it's as easy as clicking and dragging instead of animating each individual part of their body, right? But when talking about the art style, building world space shaders to shade things in the environment rather than individually UV unwrapping and texturing each individual object was a really, really good thing to discover. It wasn't something that I initially had thought of. I had done a lot of shader programming before, and I did a lot of stuff with the Unity shader graph and the effects, but it was hard to get to that point. Eventually I went and I bought FlatKit, which is a Unity asset pack. It's a shader library, and they have some really, really cool stuff in there, and it's really well optimized. So just that was another aspect as well. And then same goes for art assets and creating maps, right? Like, instead of making each individual thing, what I would do is take a map, and what I am doing is I take a map, I build the base geometry. So I'll build some walls, I'll build the floor, right? I'll build anything that's above the player. And then I'll create prefabs, so I'll create objects that I can reuse and put them in the map. And then whenever I make a new map, I take a base, and then I take those pieces, and I'm building the map like that. So I'm not recreating everything, I'm not modeling everything unless I feel it's necessary, and I can save a lot of time from doing that. And then, of course, when working with enemies and working with the player and working with anything that has to do with combat, I expose every single variable. I make sure that every single thing that I want to tweak is tweakable and nothing is hard-coded. So theoretically, I could change everything so that this feels like a really slow turtle shooter, or I could have a ton of enemies on the screen and none of them shoot. And I could do all of this in a matter of minutes because I've exposed everything and made sure that I can modify and do that if I want to. And that has helped a lot with iteration. And I think that's all the questions. So thank you everyone for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube, I don't know where I'm going to post this specifically, but if you're watching this online, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for watching. I try to keep it brief, but I will for sure answer any questions that anyone has. If you do want to ask questions, feel free to do so in the Rockhopper server or in the comments of this video if this video has comments, or just reach out to me. But thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I've just been so ecstatic about being able to share my work with everyone. So have a good one. Thank you so much.